Hey, so I hope you can see the slides, and of course, we're going to start from the beginning. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So today's session is systematic literature reviews. And as I already said yesterday, this is normally our most popular module because, obviously there is a lot of value in putting together a good systematic review, but it can also, really help you to understand the body of work that's out there. It can really help to position your own work. And, more importantly, if you manage to publish a good literature review, it definitely also helps with, your own recognition in the field. But also, making sure that you've actually got an authoritative voice in this particular area here. When you look into my own publication record, you will see that actually systematic reviews are amongst my most cited papers. Um, and I think that's a very interesting point as well. Often, systematic reviews pay off in an area or in a field where there isn't a lot of information available yet. There are some areas that are extremely crowded with systematic reviews. We've got a lot of stuff going on ESG and, the link between ESG and financial performance, for instance, there's absolutely no shortage of systematic reviews. So these are areas, where it becomes increasingly difficult to position systematic reviews. So if you are in this area, then, and you want to do a systematic review, then you'd obviously really have to think through how to best position a review so that you can still add value to all existing reviews, which might be challenging for you to do. There are other areas where, there is not yet a good coverage of the literature. So again, can really pay off to look into those and to actually make sure, that you are the one who puts together the first good review in that particular field, right? So, yeah, but as I said, some fields are getting very crowded with reviews. So before you go through all the time and effort with putting together your own review in these areas, definitely make sure to check what other reviews are out there to make sure that you're not just duplicating existing efforts, especially if there's already a multitude of reviews published. It's not to say that you can't publish an additional review if there's already reviews published, but you will find that often journals are just becoming much more critical, especially editors, when they see that there are already such a number of reviews out there. So that's something to keep in mind. So why are we actually going with systematic reviews these days, right? So you're probably all aware of the issue that our knowledge is multiplying and multiplying really, really quickly. There are actually thousands of new scientific studies that are published every day to a point that it's becoming increasingly difficult, even for experts, to stay on top of all the latest developments, right? Just even when you think about our own field, there is constantly new material being produced, right? When we just look into the publications from 2024, 2025 in our area, across all journals, there's just such a large number of publications out there, right? And that's definitely a big issue just to kind of sift through all that material, to read it, to understand it. Um, we often see, in particular in our line of work, that replication is not encouraged, which also makes this more challenging. You will often find a big focus on novelty. When, we submit to journals, there's always the question around the next novel contribution. The challenge that this is creating is that we're actually not testing or retesting any existing knowledge, but instead we are creating, more and more and more, and often studies that are vastly different from each other, which means we really don't have a good number of replication studies. This has changed in recent years. You might have seen that there are a couple of journals now that are actually encouraging replication studies to be carried out or that are also encouraging validation of existing work. But at the end of the day, there is still a lot of unsystematic proliferation of knowledge. What I mean by that is, for instance, in our field, it's very uncommon that someone, does exactly the same study with exactly the same set of organization or set of managers, for instance, to see if results stack up or if that can be replicated on a slightly different set of organizations with a similar sort of research design. That's often not the case. You will find, in particular, in fields across management, accounting, finance, to some degree, also adjacent fields that the research questions are very different. The sampling is very different. The population of firms that we are looking at is very different. So that actually means that we don't really have a good grasp, more often than not, regarding what variables are, for instance, predicting certain outcomes, right? So systematic reviews here can help to draw together this unsystematic proliferation of research that we've got going on at the minute, and can help us to make sense out of the body of existing research that's out there. Now, this might seem a little bit daunting, and it can be, right? So some of the work that I've done on systematic reviews has drawn together thousands of studies. And I know that initially sounds like, oh my goodness, how can you even read that many papers? But what we are trying to do here is also to show you ways for how you can actually start analyzing this work, but also, ways to actually visualize the existing body of knowledge so that it becomes a little less challenging to go through all this body of research. Um, a big point to make here is also that unfortunately in recent years we've also seen that a lot of junk science gets published, and that makes it even harder to conduct systematic reviews. So we do have a lot of journals these days, that are going with these open access formats and are just accepting papers on a very rapid basis. And, I'm definitely not against open access publishing, quite the opposite. I've done, a lot of open access publishing myself, but you will find there are publishers out there that will, encourage very rapid acceptances of manuscripts, often within days. And the challenge here is, that the studies that are being published have simply not undergone any kind of thorough peer review. And for us as researchers trying to do systematic reviews, there are often real questions around, what do we actually want to include in reviews? And are there perhaps certain publishers or certain journals that we may not want to include in a review just simply because they would completely crowd out the existing knowledge base, essentially, but also potentially with information that's not that valuable for us. So that's something to keep in mind. But, as you can see, the name systematic also suggests that ideally we want to collect all the available evidence and not filter in the first instance. But given these challenges, that's definitely something to consider here for us. So yeah, as mentioned, we do face severe limitations when it comes to trying to peruse all the existing studies, right? Time constraints, publications. There might even be publications in other languages on the same topics. Often you will find that, it is really, really difficult for anyone in the field to really have a good grasp of all the available studies on a particular topic of interest, but to also critically appraise this body of evidence, what's out there, what do these studies actually contribute, what do we know, what do we not know, and at the end of the day, as I already mentioned, right, I think biggest challenge for doing systematic reviews is also to set some parameters around what evidence we want to include or exclude from a systematic review. We obviously still want to make sure that it is systematic, but by the same degree, we also want to, obviously make sure that we are not including low value publications in the review, especially from journals that may potentially not have a very good, thorough peer review process in place. So I often get the question, Are we actually attempting, to collect all studies on a particular topic? So are we attempting to show, the whole truth of a particular, in quotation marks, of course, in a particular area, or is it better to focus on a few studies only to include them in a systematic review? Obviously with systematic reviews, we try to cast a wide net. We try to really map what's out there. But of course, and as you can probably guess, assembling all available evidence can be highly time consuming and can be a very challenging task. And it's often something that can't really be accomplished, very quickly. Um, what a few common issues, that we often encounter with systematic or with any type of literature review, actually. Um, Many authors present a cursory overview only, and that's fine, for instance, with journal articles, right? Sometimes, all that you need is just to point to a few studies to present your present work. So I'm not suggesting that every review now should become a systematic review. If you are, for instance, already familiar with your area, you would like to do another study in that particular field, you've already got a good idea of how you're going to be locating that in the literature for purposes of a journal article. You might just want to point to a few important landmark studies only. But what we see often as common issues with literature reviews actually is that, there are often important studies that are being missed, which is a real challenge, right? So, for instance, I'm actually marking a lot of PhD theses, and often the lit review, I have to say, is a section that I'm dreading a little bit, when it comes to reading it, because often it's not really drawn together into a compelling storyline, right? Sometimes it's not clear why someone has cited a particular area of work and has excluded other studies, right? Sometimes it's not quite sure, or we can't be sure, why certain streams of literature have been selected and why others have been excluded, for instance, right? Important contributions may have been missed. And we often get a lot of reviews as well that are just simply listing studies. These authors did the following, these other authors did this other study, this team of authors did more work on this, right? So it's actually not really given us a very comprehensive background information for theory development, for testing, for positioning further work. Um, there can be this, mentioning of prior work, but there's often no mentioning of causal links. So what variables are actually causing what sort of outcomes, right? What has prior work really told us in terms of causal mechanisms? What variables have already been assessed in prior work? Where we're heading with a particular field, right? So that particular mechanism or these mechanisms are often not really detailed. So that again is also a real challenge with literature reviews. So consequently, we've actually done a lot of work on systematic reviews. So in particular, so myself, my team, we've kind of looked into ways how we can pull together systematic reviews, but also how we can do this in a way, that we can really add value with those reviews. So of course, I don't just want to, write a review just for the sake of having a review article, basically. So the idea is really, to make sure that it is a value add to a particular field. We have also done systematic reviews in areas where we currently see that there is a little bit of a lack of, coherent evidence, for instance. So some of the recent work that I've done with colleagues is around household solar adoption, right? So there's actually a lot of research out there that looks into household solar adoption and what's leading people to adopt solar panels or not, the motivations, is it financial motivation, is it saving the environment, is it because they're getting government subsidies? Is it because there are certain policy measures in place, right? So there's absolutely no shortage of studies in this particular area. And a lot of them, again, are not systematic, which is really problematic as well. Every study has sort of tested its own set of variables. So what we've actually done is we've said, okay, we need to draw this evidence base together because it's obviously also really important for policy purposes, right? If we know what variables are driving solar adoption, then we can potentially feed that into policy design to make sure that the right kind of variables are being looked at in a policy setting, right? So, for instance, are subsidies actually helping, household solar subsidy programs? Are they leading to desired outcomes or not? And do we actually have empirical evidence on this? So, yeah, we drew together a large number of studies around this to really kind of look into this particular topic area, and to make sure, that we really add to the existing evidence base in this field, and also to provide this, not just as a review in itself, but actually as a starting point for policy consideration, for policy design, and that we can really position our study in a way as well that it does have, this direct policy relevance as well. Um, yeah, this work has really focused around, this variation in existing research, explaining household solar panel investment. And I think for that particular study, we drew together, I think, over 230 studies as well. So you can see systematic reviews are actually quite often quite significant when it comes to drawing together existing work. Um, the key point with systematic reviews is we want them to be systematic, right? And that is the real challenge for systematic reviews. How do we actually proceed in a way that we can apply scientific strategies, so in a way that we limit bias through the review process itself? We don't want to introduce any additional biases. Like any other type of research, systematic reviews can also be subject to bias. If you are only including certain studies and you're leaving out others, you could potentially, introduce a skewed view of the research that's out there. Good systematic reviews will have very clear and rigorous reporting methods. And increasingly, we have also in our field seen an adoption of what's called the PRISMA guidelines. So these are guidelines that have been developed to guide systematic review processes. So that essentially is a particular, a step-by-step template that you can follow as well with your own work, to make sure that you follow a systematic review process. So PRISMA stands for the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. It's obviously quite a mouthful, and has been put in place as a reporting protocol to improve the transparency and the completeness of systematic reviews. And essentially, that's a 27-item checklist that's available online and that you can access as well, of course. That helps you, just to kind of check whether or not you've actually followed certain good steps for systematic reviews. So if you are interested in actually getting access to this type of protocol, right, just search for PRISMA systematic reviews. I've also put it in the chat. And that will, give you access to that particular list here as well. And that already gives you, reporting protocols for systematic reviews as well. Prisma has not been developed within, our field of, business, finance, management, and so on. Some of the items, sometimes, it's sort of being developed, obviously also with other fields in mind, right? So you have to take that into consideration when you look at it, but I think it's still an extremely good framework to make sure that you do have systematic reporting protocols in place for your own work as well. So yeah, my colleagues and I, we've also done a lot of work in terms of actually developing the systematic review process. And I have to say, it's really interesting to kind of see the evolution here as well, right? So we've actually done work on the methods of systematic reviews, because we also found that, systematic reviews are sometimes done in a way that they're actually not very systematic, and that authors are also really struggling to report that information and, to draw this together into a compelling review process. So one of the articles, and we've also put that into the Dropbox folders, is actually a publication on the process of publishing systematic reviews. And again, you might find it helpful potentially for your own work as well to have that as a template in place, where we go through step by step through, extracting your articles for systematic reviews. How do you locate the existing evidence? How do you filter that information? How do you summarize it? How can you visualize it? Essentially, the main idea of systematic reviews is that we put protocols in place, that we are not just drawing together a random set of articles that we happen to find, for instance, through our searches on Google Scholar, or, some of you might jump onto databases to extract articles, right? What we are actually trying to do is to put a really systematic search design in place, and an exhaustive search design as well. What we are doing is we're searching existing databases, so publication databases. Scopus is a big one. Web of Science is another big one. And we are putting these protocols in place to search these databases to make sure that we draw together essentially all available articles on a particular topic, to make sure that we do start with a really rigorous sample in place. So now putting these systematic parameters in place, as I said, that's often, the first kind of crucial step. And it even comes down to things like this, the selection of the database, right? I often get questions around what's actually better to choose, Web of Science or Scopus. They do have different coverages. Web of Science is not just the same as Scopus, because they do index different journals actually. And the Web of Science is also different to Scopus in terms of how they're handling indexing of what we call great literature. So, sometimes you will find that, for instance, conference papers are being indexed, right? That there's a thesis work that's being indexed. And again, the databases vary. So these days, to make the review as systematic as possible, we often work with more than one database as well, to make sure that, we do get the best possible coverage. And we don't even stop there. We often look above and beyond, to see what other work we might have missed. So for instance, through a search of referenced work. So once we have found our list of articles, we would actually kind of go through all the references again to see if all the articles that we found might reference any additional articles that we might have missed. So you can see that this is actually a very exhaustive search that we are conducting here for the purpose of systematic reviews. Now, a systematic review can include studies that are qualitative as well as quantitative, right? So, okay, let me unpack this a little bit. Yesterday, we talked about qualitative research. So, for instance, studies that are using interview data. There are, obviously ways then to also summarize this existing information into a systematic review, right? The challenge is here that you don't necessarily have any numerical results, which can make this more challenging to, really review this work and to summarize it. But it is definitely possible as well. So in these instances, we would obviously not offer any statistical combination of the existing evidence. We would sort of go more with a narrative approach towards describing what kind of evidence we found in these studies. But it's definitely possible to include those studies as well. The other way to do a systematic review is to only focus on studies that offer, statistical results, statistical findings, and to then conduct what we call a meta-analysis. So what that means is that we draw together the existing findings and analyses of studies, and we would then statistically combine them and make sure that we are essentially reporting on the statistical combination and summary of this existing work. This might sound a little bit confusing, but when you look into, some of the reviews that I've done and that we've also put into the Dropbox folder, you will see the differences. So a meta-analysis is really a study that focuses essentially on only analyzing existing quantitative studies, and then a statistical combination of that evidence published in these quantitative studies, whereas like a qualitative review would focus on drawing together, studies that don't necessarily offer statistical results. And the way that you can do this in a systematic review is, for instance, to include tables that overview what these studies have actually found, right? So what that might mean is, that you create a table that lists, okay, these are the authors, this is the work that they've done. They've conducted, 40 interviews, and the main finding from these interviews was the following, right? So you could kind of do up a table that summarizes the evidence that way. So yeah, there are very different ways to do reviews. So obviously, before you start doing a review, you have to make some design decisions here, right? Regarding, okay, which of these avenues do I want to go down? And also, how do I actually want to set up the review? As I mentioned, for our study on solar, what we have done is we have focused on a meta-analysis simply because we wanted to know what kind of empirical evidence, what quantitative evidence do we have available for factors that are motivating solar uptake. And the reason why we went with a meta-analysis here in this particular instance is because other reviews had already attempted to draw together, existing evidence, but not necessarily in a way that looked at, the quantitative evidence behind it. So we didn't just want to add another review that was reviewing additional potential factors for solar adoption. We really wanted to put a review out there that was actually, collecting the available empirical evidence. So just something to keep in mind before you start your review, what type of evidence do you actually want to include in your review as well? Um, so yeah, if you are doing, if you're looking at a decision as well, publishing a paper versus publishing a thesis, right? Many journal articles, you will actually, for many of these articles, you will only need a very small literature section at the beginning, right? So there is not enough scope to put an entire systematic review up front. That would obviously be a different situation, right? You would highlight your research question, point to a number of important studies in that particular area, right? But if you actually wanted to publish a systematic review in its own right, that's possible as well. So then your publication would focus just on the systematic review. You might want to adopt, a systematic review process. Alternatively, if you are writing a thesis, a systematic review can also be very interesting for you to look into the existing body of literature to make sure that you've got a really solid foundation. Okay, we've got a question on the chat. How about a literature review in a book chapter? Look, again, depends on where you want to take this work, right? If you're writing the book chapter, as like similar to a journal paper, with the idea to only have a smaller literature review up front and to focus on other insights or findings, then you may not necessarily want to go down the entire systematic review avenue. But again, if you're actually thinking it could be an interesting way to look at a field of research, then you could also, of course, adopt a systematic review method as well. So this is very, very versatile. So you can essentially, make your own decisions on whether or not this particular method is useful for you or not. So yeah, I think it's a very versatile way to do it as well. Again, a book chapter might be very short. Some book chapters are only 5,000 to 6,000 words. So there might not necessarily be enough room for systematic review. But again, if you're being very concise, you might actually, also be able to offer that as part of a book chapter as well. So how are we going to get started? That's the big question, right? So I've talked enough about all the background for systematic reviews. So how do we actually get this, right? So we have put a number of papers into the Dropbox folder for you to look at. We've got 2 examples in there, for instance, where we focus on reviewing finance research, right? You will see that systematic literature review papers, so papers that are focusing just on that systematic review, they have often a structure that starts, with the introduction, then introduces the method in terms of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, how we locate studies, select studies, the criteria that we use to assess the work and the evidence. And then the big part of the paper would be the results, right? So presenting, what we found. In much of my work, I've used citation maps, and I show you that later on in this presentation to actually map out different research streams. And of course, as part of a good systematic review, we wouldn't just leave the reader hanging there. What actually really is the value of a systematic review is that you also can discuss, emerging research directions, questions that are unanswered, right? Work that still needs to be done. So that actually is, I think, the real value of doing a systematic review, that you map the existing evidence base, but then also showcase where there might be areas where we actually don't understand the existing evidence very well. Let me just quickly look into the chat. We've got another question. How many papers should be reviewed? Look, with systematic reviews, we would go with all papers on a topic, right? So systematic reviews means that we are not focusing on getting like 20 or 30 or 40 papers. Systematic reviews actually means that we are going out there and we are collecting all available evidence, right? If there's 2,000 papers on a topic, a systematic review would capture all existing papers, right? And that wouldn't necessarily pose any limitations, right? So for a systematic review, I wouldn't just go like, oh, okay, I'm going to get myself 10 or 20 studies to review. It would really be, let me see how many studies are out there. And if there's 10,000 papers published, that's the way it is, right? We wouldn't necessarily try to cut this down. Of course, if I look at 10,000 papers in a particular field, I'm going to ask myself the question, of course, if I really want to do a systematic review on 10,000 papers, there might be some ways to limit this information, right? But yeah, ultimately, a systematic review would draw together all existing papers on a particular topic, right? So you will see some of the papers that I've put up as well. The papers, our review of sustainability, we looked at over 3,500 papers in that particular literature review, right? So the other question is, when should a qualitative literature review be used and when should a quantitative literature review be used? Does it depend on the topic? Yes, look, to some extent it does depend on the topic, right? So again, going back to the example that I gave you, right, to our study on solar uptake. So what we wanted to know in that particular study is, right, what evidence do we have available for predictors of household solar adoption, and do we actually have good empirical evidence to understand what factors are motivating or driving household solar adoption. That had obviously a particular, sort of like focus, that particular review, right? So we were only interested in the quantitative evidence in this particular instance. So we discarded studies that were, focused on interviews or focus groups or were just conceptual in nature because those conceptual studies were obviously not really informing our research question. But you might have also areas where there is not necessarily a lot of quantitative evidence available. And I've come across that as well in my work, So for instance, we did a review on evidence around climate adaptation. And the studies that we found were very mixed method. Some of them were actually presenting empirical evidence, some of them were conceptual, some were presenting other types of evidence. So we decided to then, grab the available body of literature there, and then rather to do a meta-analysis on the entire thing, we actually decided in the paper to present these studies, just present them in table format. And then to show, okay, this study, for instance, interviewed 20 people and this was their finding. This study was based on a survey with, this number of people and this was their particular finding, right? So there are different ways of actually drawing together systematic reviews. And I'll give you a couple of links as well for this. So then you can actually see what the difference in the reviews is as well. So, as you can already see up front, a very important point to decide is what are we including and what are we excluding in a review, right? You need to be really clear before you start your systematic review how you want to set this up, right? So you need to be absolutely 100% clear about what's your topic, what information do you want to include or exclude for that particular review? What's your research question, right? What to consider, of course, your study design. Is there a lot of evidence that's already published? As I said, some fields like ESG, environmental social governance, right? There are hundreds of papers, thousands of papers in that field. It becomes increasingly difficult to do a systematic review in that particular area, right? But there are other emerging fields of research, where you have got a much smaller set of studies, right? So for instance, again, our study on household solar adoption, we found 230 odd papers for that particular study. So obviously a lot smaller evidence base and a lot more easy to handle as well. And the big question that you also have to think about is how do you want to handle gray literature? What do we mean by gray literature? That's essentially every type of literature that's not yet published in a journal article. Could be conference papers, could be thesis, could be journal articles that are still in the making and have been published on preprint servers. It could be reports that are out there, policy reports that might be based on research, but are just not published as a paper. So it's really important here that you decide how to handle gray literature. And I'm getting lots of questions as well around what's actually the best way to do this. I have to tell you, there is not necessarily one right or wrong answer here for this particular area on how to handle gray literature, right? Sometimes there is benefit in focusing only on peer-reviewed publications because it makes your life easier. It's a cleaner process. It means that literature has undergone peer review, which often adds quality to the literature as well. And that can pay off in very established fields. But some other times you may find that there is not necessarily a lot of literature that's published. There might be more conference papers. Some fields are actually, very good with authors. They are very good with bringing out new work in conference papers very quickly. So again, have a look into what's actually out there, what's available, and then you have to make that consideration, that decision for your own review. What do you want to include and what do you want to exclude? And of course, that should be documented clearly as part of your research design. Ideally, you should also not just exclude studies because you don't like them or because they might have some flaws attached to them, right? The idea is we are still including them in the systematic review, but then later on we would offer a commentary on this type of work as part of the review process, to point out that there could be issues with existing work. So in order to then decide on our inclusion criteria, right, we would actually need to look into finding existing work on databases, right? I'll just have a quick look. We have got another question, I think, before I so yes, reports from institutions like OECD and so on, yes, they are what we call gray literature, right? So essentially that's work that's not being published in the academic realms, so to speak, right? So everything that, could be released. Yes, you mentioned also PwC, so consulting reports. So yes, we would classify that as gray literature. And of course, right, you have to make that decision as a researcher. Do you want to look at that information or do you not want to look at that information, right? So that's part of your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Sometimes it can be really valuable to look at that type of work, right? So for instance, the United Nations have done a lot of work around climate adaptation, mitigation, and so on. So if that's your area, if that's your field, you will actually find really, really good gray literature out there. But there might be other fields where that's just not paying off for you, right? So it's just a bit of a consideration actually regarding what you think should be included in your systematic review. So in a first step, we would then think about, okay, I've now got, my area, my topic area that I want to review. Obviously, we need to find literature. So what we would normally do with a systematic review is to put together a search string that will allow us to locate existing work in databases. Um, and that's the first and the big hurdle with systematic reviews. Obviously, our search string needs to be a good one so that we can actually uncover the existing evidence. So one of my reviews was around resilience, right? That actually made it really clear what the search term and what the search string should be, because I just went with this truncated, resilient, and then the wildcard symbol as a search term. The wildcard we put in there into searches because it picks up on variations of the term, such as resilience or resiliency. You can, within databases, limit your search to business and management, for instance, or to finance, to economics, right? If you kind of wanted to sort of narrow down your search a little bit further. But I'm a little bit critical these days, I have to say, about just simply limiting yourself to a particular field of research, because a lot of scholars these days are publishing in cross-disciplinary settings. So of course, if you limit yourself only to studies published in business or only in management or only in finance, you might actually miss important contributions here, right? But it can, of course, be useful to put some limitations in place, because resilience is also used in this particular instance here, to go with this example, right? The word resilience is also used in work such as, socio-ecological resilience, right? It's not just necessarily used for business and management or organization types of phenomena. Resilience also refers to, the resilience of natural systems or the resilience, of people in psychology, or, it's actually a term that's used across a number of different fields. So it can pay off to put some parameters in place um, to make sure that you're not just picking up on research that's published outside the area that you are interested in, right? Um, Again, it will require some trial and error to actually sit down, put together a search string, and to test it in the databases. I'm not just simply coming up with a search term, putting it in the databases, extracting the papers, and going on with life, right? Often enough, we would really craft a very, very carefully designed search string with many iterations as well, right? So for our review of solar panel adoption, I think we went through probably around 10 to 15 iterations of the search string, just because we realized that the initial search string that we had was giving us too many papers that were not relevant. So we then decided, okay, we need to make the search string better. We need to search for different terms. We actually also need to put some exclusion criteria around it so that we are not just getting every solar study under the sun. We just definitely wanted to make sure to have a defined parameter in place, so that, we could really focus on the key contributions. Um, Another way to check that your search is actually good and is exhaustive, is to check the references of the papers you uncovered through your systematic search to see if you missed any important contributions. So that's what we call a cited reference check. And there are actually some programs in place that will help you to do it. So you don't have to manually go through all the papers. So for instance, the program that we used in the past, HistCite, that is a program that will have a cited reference collection available for you to look through. Let me quickly check the new questions that we have. Are papers from predatory journals gray papers? I would actually put them in their own category and say that they are predatory journal papers, because gray literature is normally, literature that's published outside of academia, but is still of high quality, right? And might even be of superior quality. These are often, carefully crafted reports, whereas, predatory journals, they would they are characterized often by high volumes of low quality work. And, again, this is also a consideration that you might have to make upfront in your research design if you know that there are certain journals that are in your area that are predatory journals, or that are journals, that publish questionable papers. You might actually have to think about how do you want to handle that upfront in your search term, right? So obviously, we don't want to publish a systematic review and just accuse some journals of being predatory and exclude them from our search. But it could be worthwhile to put some parameters in place regarding, your search term, to make sure that you're actually limiting yourself to indexed papers, so papers that are indexed in Web of Science, in Scopus, because that already excludes some of, the really kind of bad predatory journals, because there is a certain threshold to be listed in Scopus and in Web of Science. So then we have got a question around to what extent should search terms be applied within articles limited to the title, abstract, and keywords as well. I've got some information coming up on that as well, right? But again, I normally like to search for keywords in the title, the abstract, and the keywords of an article. If you search for keywords in the full paper, that can often lead to a lot of false positives, right? And you might actually end up with a lot of irrelevant articles. Sometimes when you actually end up with a search that's yielding a lot of results, it can be worthwhile to just limit yourself just to the title of a paper to see if you're actually getting good results that way, right? But I normally do abstract keywords, the title of the paper, and not necessarily the full text, because the full text sometimes, when people are writing, you are kind of getting a lot of terms that are being introduced as well. But of course, we would make sure that we do a cited reference check as well to ensure that we haven't missed any contributions. So how do we then actually proceed in terms of, data cleaning? And it's actually very similar to what you've already learned in qualitative research. We would do triangulation as well, right? So when I do a systematic review, even if I'm doing it on my own, I would normally ask colleagues for input into this, right? I wouldn't just jump onto a database, running my search stream, doing my extraction, and then publishing this whole thing. I would actually say to colleagues, look, I'm trying to do a systematic review on the following topic. I'm thinking about searching for articles with the following keywords. Do you think I might have missed anything? Do you think I need to somehow amend this search string? Do you think I need to do things differently? But then also when I'm actually finding results in Scopus or in the Web of Science, I would again ask colleagues for help and say, look, can you help me check the papers here? You could also get, research assistants here involved to make sure that the information that I found is actually on point and that I have extracted the right sort of articles that I actually wanted to get. Sometimes when you search for a keyword, um, you might actually find really unexpected search results. So for instance, especially when you search for acronyms, they might actually be used in different fields, meaning different things, right? We recently did a review on, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so TCFD reporting. But it turns out that TCFD as an acronym is different, is used in other fields to mean completely different things, right? So that's actually something to keep in mind as well. So just because we know a particular acronym, that doesn't necessarily mean that this acronym is only used in our field. It can actually also be used in different fields for different to mean completely different things as well, right? Sometimes we actually find, that there are inconsistencies even in the Web of Science and in Scopus. So sometimes we actually have to go in and slightly correct our extracted findings just simply to unify spelling, for instance. We've had instances where authors weren't detected correctly in our search just simply because their name wasn't spelled the same in a consistent fashion. As someone with a difficult last name, I can relate to that issue. But if you're searching, for instance, for certain authors or for their contributions, right, it could actually be an issue as well that you're not getting a full set of results just because of that kind of issue. So for larger reviews, I would definitely suggest consider forming a research team, right? You can absolutely do systematic reviews as a single person team. But again, right, you might actually subconsciously introduce some biases. It's actually quite good to enlist the help of colleagues as expert reviewers, that you're not just you yourself making all the decisions, right? Of course, right, and this is what I said, too many cooks here, right? The more people you ask, the more opinions you are getting. So make sure that you are getting good people here to help. It can actually be really good, to have someone on your team with content expertise, someone with method expertise, and someone who has got a background and is trained in doing systematic reviews here as well. So the main point with systematic reviews is what we want to achieve is that someone using the same database or the same databases and the same search terms and the same time period as you do they should come up with exactly the same set of papers and results or references out of this systematic review process, right? So in other words, what you're doing should be replicable. So you ideally would want to create a replicable systematic review. So I'm getting another question here. If searching within the title, abstract, and keywords, if there are too many articles to review, is it acceptable to limit the search to the title only? Look, again, this is a decision that you would have to make as a researcher, right? If you're limiting yourself to the title only just for the sake of narrowing down the search results, you might potentially miss important contributions, papers that have not mentioned the keywords in the title, right? And we see that happening a lot of times. Obviously, if I want to publish a paper, for instance, about climate change and sustainability, I might mention those terms in the title of the paper, right? And say, okay, impact of climate change on sustainability outcomes. So I might actually have those words in the title. But there are many of our colleagues that would write a completely different title. So you might actually miss important contributions when you limit your review to the title only. So I would test different ways, different ways to search within the databases to see what happens to your results, right? So if you are restricting yourself to the title only, are you actually getting a good set of papers, or are you losing important papers in comparison to a different search, right? So you kind of have to check that a little bit yourself in the databases, to understand what's going on there, right? So I think that's very important. Again, get some input as well from colleagues on this and from someone who knows this method to make sure that you're not accidentally narrowing your search too much, because that's not the whole idea of a systematic review, right? The idea of the systematic review is to be as comprehensive and systematic as you actually can. So here's one example, right? I thought I actually show you what this could look like. I've picked an example from a different field, but the idea is the same. It's like the same as what we are doing in, the business management finance fields as well. So here you can see this is a review that was focused on establishing whether or not vitamin D supplementation is effective or not, right? So us taking vitamin D, will that do any good to us, right? Will that actually cause any health impacts, any health benefits? So you can see here, the researchers have set up this review in a way that they were very systematic. They looked through a number of different databases, Medline, Cochrane, Embase, and Web of Science. Of course, some of these databases are not applicable to us because we're not medical researchers, right? So Medline might not be the right one, but Web of Science is for us as well, right? So we have Web of Science. We can also use Scopus as well. You can see that they went through the effort of identifying other studies. So they contacted their colleagues to see is there anything we might have missed. Then they went through a check of removing duplicates. They excluded studies that they deemed not relevant. So here, given that we are in the medical sciences, they were actually focusing on studies with randomized controlled trials. We will talk about more about this issue when it comes to experiments, right? But what that actually means is, studies that implementing a very good sort of way of doing experiments, right? And studies that didn't meet those criteria, they were excluded here from this particular review. So you can see that they were left with, a certain number of studies, and then they actually went through the effort of obtaining data for all these studies, checking all of that, and then doing an analysis on the entire sample that they actually found, and were deemed as, suitable for including in the particular review here. So you can see a very, very systematic way of setting this up. Again, this might inspire you to do something similar, right? It might not be vitamin D effectiveness. It might actually be, okay, what factors are contributing to certain types of outcomes, right? So it might just be that, instead of vitamin D effectiveness, you go, is this particular policy effective, right? Or is this particular intervention effective? Is this particular management approach effective, right? So you could actually set up a very similar kind of design and question for your own research as well. Is there a way to check for overlapping or duplicate studies? This is a question that I just got on the chat. Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, duplicate studies, we would normally be able to quite easily identify. It would just mean that, you've essentially got the same study listed twice. Normally, when we export results from these databases, they would be in a CSV file. So you can actually, sort by title, or you can even get the program to highlight duplicates. So they are super easy to find. When you work with some programs, R, for instance, has got the Bibliometrics package where you can import information as well, or HistCite, as I mentioned, a different program. There are ways as well that these programs wouldn't actually, work with duplicate records. So if duplicate records appear, they would automatically be considered as a joint record. What can sometimes happen with duplicate records is that the management, the reference programs, they're sometimes not identifying them, especially if it's the same reference, but there are some variations, in spelling, for instance, or in author names or whatnot. So it does pay off to just go through the list of papers that you found, and have a quick check manually through that to make sure, that you haven't actually accidentally picked up duplicates as well, right? So I'm pretty sure here the authors would have just actually gone through the list here and would have made sure that they're only retaining unique studies in this particular instance here as well. And of course, duplicates can appear quite easily. If you search across multiple different databases, you would find the same study again in a different database as well, right? So when we are searching in the Web of Science and in Scopus, we would potentially get, 60-70% overlap between studies. So we would just simply have to make sure that we are integrating this into one overall final set of papers for our further analysis. Yeah. So this is one particular way how you can set it up. Again, you might just want to adopt such a design for different kind of purposes. Of course, here, this is from a different field. So I'm getting another question around how many papers are enough for systematic literature review. Look, again, we're not really looking for an upper number, right? In a sense, for a systematic review, I'm more interested in getting all the papers that need to be included in that review. Some areas might only have 20 or 30 papers that are relevant for inclusion. Other papers, I mentioned before, our big review on sustainability, we found over 3,500 papers and we included all of them. Right. Of course, we made sure that they were relevant before including them, but we're not necessarily looking for a defined number here, right? A systematic review should just make sure that it's systematic. It's not necessarily targeting a certain number of papers. So yeah, that's something you can do a systematic review on a field that's only got 10 or 15 publications, right? But that might potentially be a bit on the low end, I have to say, right? But nonetheless, if you're writing a good review on that, could definitely be, a good contribution. Okay, if you're searching multiple databases such as Scopus and Google Scholar, look, the way that we normally handle duplicates is, right, I would run a search on Scopus, I would run a search on Web of Science, I would run a search potentially on any other database that we deem relevant, and then you would extract the results, and you can actually get these databases to save results in a certain way, right? So they would give you, for instance, fields for the authors, the title, the abstract, the DOI object identifier. And they are all good ways to then check for duplicates, right? So the digital object identifier is meant to be a unique identifier. So that's a very good way to look for duplicates, right? If you then put it all together into one big Excel spreadsheet, for instance, your results, and that immediately lets you search for duplicates in the digital object identifier column. So that's a really good way to check for duplicates, right? But you would have to go through the search and extraction process for every individual database, and then you would actually have to combine the results afterwards. I got a question if we will be covering OneNote. I have to say I've never used it for systematic review. In that regard, no, I'm not going to be covering it here. Of course, if anyone has used it, I'm more than happy to see how that's been implemented. So if you've got a good example, that would be really interesting to share as well, right? But normally here for the systematic review process, we would use the types of packages that I mentioned before that were Bibliometrics, the R package Bibliometrics, that's a really powerful one. HistCite, we've used that as well. So that's a really good one as well to use. And yeah, so there are definitely packaging out there. Some people use VOS Viewer. I have to say, with some of these visualization programs, I'm a little bit skeptical because they produce very nice looking maps, but that's not necessarily conducive to actually having a good, robust systematic review in place, if that makes sense. Do we have a minimum number of papers for systematic literature review? Look, you don't necessarily need to have a minimum number, right? If you want to do a systematic review on 15 or 20 papers, I'm pretty sure that could work as well. But you obviously have to consider as well, where do you want to publish this, right? If you are reviewing a very, very small field of research only, you might not necessarily get traction from a journal, right? So they might not be interested in publishing a review if there's only like 20 or 25 papers out there. But, I'm not going to discourage you from doing this, right? If you're doing a really great review on a very small number of articles, I'm pretty sure that you would still get traction with that actually. So you could still look into that. Okay, so what are we doing in terms of analysis, right? Um, Before doing a systematic review, I'm always suggesting to everyone, have a look if there's already existing systematic reviews out there. Because there's nothing worse than doing all the work and then finding that someone else is doing exactly the same that you're already doing, or potentially it's already been published, right? So once you have extracted your search results, I'm also suggesting, to really think through how you want to structure the review, right? So it's often difficult to say from the outset or from the beginning, this is exactly how my systematic review should look like, because we don't know exactly what type of evidence we will find through the review process, right? But have a look into, once you have got your entire list of papers, right? First of all, are there already existing reviews? If there are already existing reviews out there, we definitely need to check what these people have done, because we want to make sure that we are not just reinventing the wheel, right? If there are many existing reviews, definitely need to check how they've been structured, what search parameters they've come, and how we can potentially augment the existing review work. What we also want to know then in a next step is what has and hasn't been done. I'm going to try and understand, okay, with what we can kind of see from our systematic review, where do we see, a significant focus of existing work, but can we also identify areas potentially that are underdeveloped? Because that's interesting and important for us when we are writing up the systematic review, to kind of also highlight areas that are potentially under-researched, right? So again, depending on your design choices that you are making for your systematic review, do you then to consider how do you best present a summary of your work, right? So if you have opted into, a quantitative review, a meta-analysis, we would obviously expect to see results tables, correlations, statistics, right? But if you have decided on, a more descriptive analysis, you could implement, visualization tools such as a citation map, and I'll show you how that looks like in a little while. It's also perfectly fine to construct lists with your studies, right? So we've done that with a lot of our reviews that we would actually put together for a reader of that review a table that says, okay, this is the studies, or these are the studies that we are looking at, right? These are the authors, that's the title, that's the main finding, that's what they've looked at, right? That's the conclusion that that particular article has reached. That's perfectly fine to do as well. But obviously keep in mind, if you've got more than a few hundred articles, doing your own tables for a paper becomes a very tedious process. Also means that it becomes very hard to publish this because no journal will want to have, a massive sort of like table in there unless you put it into an appendix. So that's definitely something worthwhile to consider as well. That you're actually looking into how do you want to present the evidence. It really pays off to look into existing systematic reviews to get some inspiration, and you will see that there is, a number of different ways for how you can report results. It can be interesting to offer some descriptive statistics, the number of articles that are published over time and these types of things. But you also have to consider how much value is that adding for a reader. I think it's often very interesting to have things such as, citation maps or meta-analytical results in a paper, because that will actually give you, I think, the most bang for your buck actually in these types of articles. So here is one example from a team of researchers. They have used a meta-analysis. To give you a little bit of background information here for those of you not familiar with this particular field of research. So this comes out of psychology, and there's this assumption in psychology or in parts of that literature that there are five big personality traits, right? Extroversion, emotional stability, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. So they have been studied in a lot of different studies to try and understand all sorts of different outcomes, right? How that is impacting, people's job performance, how it's impacting all sorts of, outcomes, in different job areas, in different job categories, and so on. So these people have said, okay, we need to look into this further. We actually want to draw together all the existing evidence. We want to really understand what's already been done. So they went out there and they got all available studies that looked into, these five personality traits, and that looked also into different job categories. And what they did is they basically, you know, kind of aggregated all the existing evidence into one overall study to kind of say like, okay, what do we actually know about different occupational groups, about these personality traits, and how they actually play out in terms of job performance. So that's an example here for a quantitative meta-analysis, right? You will find different types of examples. And yeah, you can just kind of see here how they have kind of aggregated all the individual studies into like one big overall study that assesses all that information that's out there, right? So it's actually one way for how you can also do a systematic review. This year would obviously have to come with certain design choices and design considerations as well around it. Here's the study that I've been talking about before, right? Our own example here, equity dimension in solar adoptions. Again, this is a meta-analysis, quantitative meta-analysis here that I've done with my colleagues, Rowan and Mauricio. And yeah, as I mentioned before, what we were really trying to get out of this work is to try and understand, what are motivators for people to adopt household solar panels. And we wanted to really know what are the links here between actually, having these motivators and having actual solar adoptions available as well. And yeah, you can see here just one example. We went out there, drew together all the available evidence here, and then looked into, what we could actually see as motivators and as factors um, that were behind solar panel adoption, and we focused here on dimension as well around equity and policy. And this type of work here actually we've got quite a fair bit of media attention for this, but also have been feeding that into policy consideration, because, this is directly speaking towards the effectiveness of policy programs as well. This review, when you go into it, you will see the search string that we used. It wasn't such a straightforward search string because we had to make sure that we were getting the right sets of studies, because as you can imagine, there is a lot of work published on solar power. If we had just searched for solar, we would have gotten, hundreds of thousands of studies, and it wouldn't really have made a lot of sense for us to review all of that. So we had to narrow the search down quite a fair bit just to get to household solar, but then also to make sure that we were getting only studies that were focusing on adoption, and that we were not just looking at other types of renewables as well, because there is actually also a lot of literature out there that looks into other types of solar technology, not just solar panels, but solar heaters and solar hot water and all sorts of other things, right? So it was actually quite challenging here to construct a search string that would get us to the right information. So if you're interested in this and how we've done this, this paper here is completely documenting the entire search process. Again, you will see, how we've been trying to be really transparent here about our design choices as well. And we've tried to make sure here to list all the different considerations as well for what we're including, what we're excluding. We did a cited reference check. We also went through, the effort to see, okay, what other studies might we have missed, to try and come up with a very, very systematic review process here around this as well. And yeah, we were very lucky to have Rowan on our team, who was the absolute mastermind when it comes to, the statistical parts of the paper here as well. And he just did a fantastic job of actually, aggregating all the statistical dimensions here as well. So that was actually a really, really interesting team that we had together here as well, right? So yeah, that's one example. If you decide that a meta-analysis is not for you, that's perfectly fine as well. You don't just have to go down the meta-analytical angle. There are definitely other ways to do a literature review as well, right? So one technique that you can apply to a literature review as well is to use coding, the process of coding. So what we already described yesterday for qualitative research, this technique can be used here as well. Literature is essentially qualitative data, right? So this is essentially textual data. You can work with that as well. So rather than, coding your interviews, you can actually code papers as well. This works particularly well if you do have a set of papers in your systematic review that's not just, quantitative evidence. If you've got, studies in here that are based on literature reviews, that are based on, interview studies and so on. So you can actually go out there and code these not these interviews, the papers that you found. So the way that this would work is, so for instance, we would have, a body of research available to us. what we would try and do is assign papers to different themes. So we could say, okay, within, our literature that we found through the systematic review process, there's a certain subset of papers that are focusing on this particular theme, and this is sort of what they're focusing on. Then we might have a different theme with, other authors for following that particular pathway, right? So that's a way to do it as well. Again, you can use these techniques of triangulation across researchers. You can just to add some robustness into your analysis as well. Of course, when you're writing up your literature review, make sure that you are not just, basically copying all the abstracts together. We often get these literature reviews that are just basically, people just going through this in a very kind of formulaic way and just going like, okay, this team of researchers, they've done this study, they found the following. This team of researchers, they've done this, they found the following. It just makes it really difficult for a reader to follow that because, it's just not really introducing any interesting, kind of variations in your write-up. So it could actually be, much more interesting to start with an overall theme and then to say, okay, I've identified this particular theme here of research, and we've got the following papers that sit underneath that theme. This is what they're overall focusing on, right? And now we've got some authors following on these elements, other authors following on those elements, right? So it's actually important, I think, that you kind of think about ways and avenues for drawing papers together, also for your write-up in a way that makes it accessible for a reader. So as promised, I was also going to talk about the citation mapping a little bit. So the visual mapping of citation linkages. That is actually a very interesting way to identify highly cited papers within your set of papers that you've identified, right? Here for these types of analyses, we would actually choose to display perhaps only the 30 or 50 most highly cited papers, just to make sure that we are not producing citation maps that are too dense. Sometimes if you've got 200, 300, 400 papers, mapping all of them is definitely possible, but it becomes visually extremely crowded, as you can imagine. So here's one example for how we've done this. This is a systematic review that is looking into, the sustainability field. So this was done in the earlier stages when sustainability wasn't such a big kind of thing as it is today in terms of publication. So this is still relatively early on when there was an increase in this particular area around sustainability. But the field, it hadn't really fully formed into the current kind of broad research that we've got going on. So back then, I did this review just essentially looking into the intellectual origins of this entire debate. And again, this was a systematic review process here as well. That looked into this is a paper that has got over 3,000 existing papers published. And the focus here for this particular citation map was obviously not to showcase all 3,000 plus papers. The idea here was to draw together some of the more highly cited papers to show how they're situated and how they're interlinked. So this is actually a historical timeline here. I know this is a little bit too small to see, but here on the left side, there is a timeline that goes from the 1950s up to the point when the paper was published. And then, these notes, they represent each paper. The size of these notes is showing how many citations it's got. And then the errors is essentially how people are cross-citing each other. So this person down here, they would have cited, papers that were further back essentially in the field. And that is allowing you to put together a historical citation map. Let me quickly check the questions. Which software did you use? This particular package, yeah, this used HistCite, so historical citation mapping. That's a program that is unfortunately no longer supported, which is really sad, I have to say, because I really liked it, but we still have old versions of this program and I've just been using it. It still works under newer Windows versions as well. It just sometimes tends to crash, which is, it just is what it is, right? But I thought it was actually a really good program. It's very simple, it's not very sophisticated. You just upload your CSV file into this program, and then it uses that information to establish these kind of cross connections amongst the papers. The only fiddly kind of thing with this program is that you have to be very careful, that essentially in the cited references you've kind of got the right format, because otherwise this program just can't detect it because it's just not very sophisticated. But yeah, we do have some further information available on this as well if you are interested in using it. I always found it really neat because it does do these beautiful citation maps, right? So I was always liking this because it's such a good way to actually show what's going on in a field of research, right? This is just a really powerful way of visualizing this. So I don't really have to worry about telling the reader of, my 3,500 odd publications that are found for purposes of this systematic review. Here, this allows me actually to see they're interrelated. And this is sort of, how I can map them. I have overlaid the shading here. So this has been my manual addition to this map. The program doesn't do it itself. This is just my own artistic addition here to the map, which I have done, just very simple with, just some shapes and forms over the top. It's not very sophisticated, but it's just to add a little bit of visual clarity to this entire figure here as well. So that's one way to do it. Um, just looking at this map here, there's one important point I should make, because this is focusing on mapping highly cited papers. It means that newer papers are sometimes not appearing on this map, right? Just because there is a focus on citation counts. And that means that sometimes newer papers are dropping off simply because they didn't have such a long time to accumulate citations, right? So that's why I'm saying here citation mapping gives more emphasis to earlier papers as they tend to have the more cites. That's an important limitation if you're using this technique. So you should definitely note that in your write-up. And you might actually add a section on emerging research or emerging themes just to make sure that you're also acknowledging new work in the area and not just older papers that have attracted citations over time, right? Again, triangulation here can be really useful as well. So for systematic reviews, right, plans may change and they do quite frequently. As mentioned before, I think it's actually really important with a systematic review to go through a bit of a process of exploration and trial and error. None of my systematic reviews have started in their final form. I have spent a lot of time in front of the computer, working through different search strings and different combinations. And, I have made sure that I have actually got a very good set of papers is to document what you are doing and to document this clearly, because otherwise you run a risk. First of all, you yourself might not be able to remember anymore. So for instance, if you go through multiple different iterations of search strings, if you are not carefully documenting this, you will start to lose track of what you're doing. But it's also really important to have that information for your write-up as well and for your method section. You need to be super clear about what have you searched for, what are your keywords, how have you extracted articles, how have you analyzed them, and so on. So the transparency here is really important as well. So a few issues to consider, right? One is error and bias. So all systematic reviews, no matter how systematic you do them, they are retrospective, and that means they are subject to potential error that can be systematic or random. Systematic errors is essentially what you are introducing yourself because, for instance, your search term might exclude important studies because it's not been constructed carefully enough, right? So you may actually miss important studies because you haven't really done a systematic review. That would be a systematic error in your review process. There can sometimes be really random errors, and this happened to us as well. So we discovered when we were using, one of the databases to extract studies, we actually uncovered that they were not really listing a particular um, um, issue of a journal. So that was the main issue that we discovered. So then we actually had to manually add this. That was a very, very interesting discovery, I have to say. But yeah, that's not, oops, sorry, I kind of went with the wrong slide. Here we go. So that was obviously a random error that appeared due to, the databases having some issues at that time. And the database then didn't list that particular issue of a journal, but that was actually a really important issue for us to have because it did contain a number of studies that we wanted to include, right? And we detected it only because we again went through our records and then we were like, okay, there seem to be a few papers missing here. That's just really bizarre. And then we discovered this random error as part of the review process, right? So the quality of your review, ultimately really depends on the extent to which you have, really thoroughly used scientific review methods. And I often find that people start out doing systematic reviews and then they go like, oh, but I just add this other stuff into it. But there are a few other studies here. They're not quite related, but they're really interesting. So maybe we should just cite them as well. That's already taking you away from a systematic review process, right? So make sure that you're actually putting good systematic measures in place for your review. So the last point I wanted to make about this is definitely around I can change minds. And, I've shown you one of the vitamin D ones, obviously from a different field, right? But, that type of work had real impacts because and cardiovascular disease in women. And consequently, when you go for blood tests, they these days often enough check actually for vitamin D levels that to make sure, that they are sufficient. So you can see that, having systematic reviews can actually be, very valuable source, of information. And that certainly, also in our fields. Of course, we are not, researching cancer or, these types of clinical outcomes, but you could envision a similar kind of contribution, if we find that certain policy interventions lead to certain outcomes for companies, that could actually be something, where we are kind of using that information to impact and to influence practice as well, right? And that's ultimately, so what we try to do through our review of solar studies, where we go, okay, which factors are impacting solar panel uptake? Can we find any common denominator here, any policy impact, any policy influence? And can we synthesize that information and actually feed this into policy processes, right? So, for us, that's kind of been the big part here. So I've given you the a number of references here. I've included the Garfield studies. Garfield is often sort of credited with, being the person that's really pushed the fields of bibliometrics forward. And, the sort of like founder of bibliometrics. He has done quite a number of studies on this, this historiographic mapping. That's also been the basis for his site. He's done a lot of work around scientometric visualizing, really interesting work, right? This is obviously from a time when the programs weren't quite as sophisticated as they are today. But, this type of work has even fed into search algorithms for Google. So quite powerful, right? Has obviously been refined over time. One of my most cited reviews is the one on resilience, resilience in business management, review of influential publications. So this one is also done with a systematic review process. this one here is a sort of like more qualitative review because a lot of these studies didn't have quantitative information available. So you will find as part of this review, it does contain these literature tables that I spoke about. But we've also got, colleagues who've actually done quite a fair bit of work around systematic reviews. As I find, as our understanding develops, we are also trying to play around with systematic review methods, and that's been really, really interesting as well. So more recently, what we've done, sort of to keep up with the latest developments, as well as, that we've actually looked into also using machine learning techniques, to make sure that we are actually availing ourselves as well to these new techniques that are available. So rather than, just doing manual extraction of all that information, planning to see if we can actually automate systematic reviews. Up to this point, I have to say the machine is not replacing the human, because you are definitely getting, some false hits through just automated detection. But nonetheless, we have had a few good successes as well, where we've managed to train the system or the approaches that we've used actually to a way that we have had very, very good successes with actually detecting the papers sufficiently as well. So that's been quite interesting as well. So we've definitely used these types of techniques as well in more recent work. Okay, next steps for you. That's actually might be something that you might want to do in your groups as well. We're obviously running a little bit out of time for today, but please feel free to liaise with your group. So as I said, the input is really, really important. That would actually be really good for you as well to get feedback on, right? To think about your own area of study, how you could potentially start doing a systematic review around this as well. Think through the different search options, right? Ways to locate studies. What are your decision steps, right? How might you want to present your result? And, don't forget, you definitely also need to document, every step of your experience as well here. Okay, we've got another question on the chat. Just let me quickly navigate to the chat. Oh, okay. Could you please share your experience about how to review and analyze a large amount of articles included in systematic reviews? Yeah, look, as I mentioned, I have actually dealt with reviews that had, multiple thousands of records. And, once you kind of get to this volume of information, you can actually it is no longer feasible to just sit down and look at every single article yourself, because you would obviously never be finished, right? So if you look at 3,500 articles, if you try and, it becomes just absolutely impossible to read every single article in detail. So we would then make very conscious kind of design choices about how to do it. So obviously I still decided to proceed with that number of articles because I didn't just want to truncate the review. But for that particular review, we used the HistCite mapping to showcase, how the highly cited articles were distributed and located within that body of literature. So here we made the decision to focus on, analyzing those highly cited articles, with the argument that, of course, highly cited articles are sort of more important articles, and I'm saying that, as you can see, with some caution around it, because citation statistics alone are obviously not always a good proxy for the importance of work, but we've sort of used it as a proxy for saying, okay, these are papers that have attracted more attention than other papers in the field. So as a result, we're displaying them in a graph, as part of the paper, and then we make sure that the paper speaks to that analysis, rather than trying to analyze each and every of these 3,000 odd articles, right? Because that, I don't think, would have been a particularly valuable addition to the literature. But with large data sets, You have also got, other design choices available to you. As I said, there are visualization tools and softwares out there. There's VOS Viewer, VOS Viewer, um, that can also handle very large data sets. I'm a little bit mindful there, I have to say, just because sometimes people just use it, they just dump, their outcome files, the CSV files in there, and then they just get VOS Viewer just to make pretty pictures. That in itself is definitely not a good systematic review, right? A systematic review needs more in terms of actually highlighting and showcasing where the literature is headed and, critical analysis and so on. So that's something to keep in mind. The best kind of visualization is not really helping you if it's not really adding anything much, right? And as an editor as well, I have to say I have rejected a fair few papers that are just using these types of visualization softwares without actually adding substance to the paper, right? But yeah, there are these types of, opportunities available. And I can also just, show you quickly, we've still got a few minutes left, a couple of examples as well where we have used Bibliometric, so the R package, that's available as well as a potential tool. Let me just quickly check. We got another question on the chat. Are there any examples or exercises for practicing the triangulation encoding technique in a systematic review? Yeah, look, what I would suggest is, right, one really good way is, to get together with your group again. You can do that, after we've concluded here. I hope you have got contact details from each other. If not, let us know and we'll get you in touch. And then use your group as a first step to say, okay, I want to do a systematic review on this particular topic area. I've kind of thought about, this is my search string, this is kind of what I want to do. And then, here's a potential list of papers. This is how I thought about grouping them. And, then you can already kind of see what the feedback is and if others are actually agreeing with you on those kind of design decisions, right? So that would be a very valuable thing to do. It's very similar to what we went through yesterday, right, with the interview data. So we would actually do very similar steps with these studies here as well, right? We would try to group them into according to different themes or according to different buckets. And, then we would present that to say, okay, we've done the systematic review and we've identified 5 different research themes within the literature. So that's definitely a way to do it as well. Yeah. All right, let me quickly, before we conclude here, just see if I can quickly show you a couple of more examples, just because we did have those questions. Just give me 1 second. That should all be on the Dropbox as well. I just need to flick my screen over to the other. Here we do have the information. Okay, just starting that different presentation here. So that will just give you a quick overview of how you can actually do this as well. Alrighty, you will find this on the Dropbox folder here as well. So there's no need to take notes for all of this. It's just essentially giving you a little bit of an introduction to visualizing bibliometric data, and this directly relates to the question that I got. Okay, how do we actually deal with very large data sets, right? That uses R, and there are some instructions here as well for how you can get started. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because, you've got the instructions here. I often get people very panicked about programming in R, but the good news is, with Bibliometrics, you have actually got a very easy way to do this. And this is essentially to follow these instructions here. And this will bring up a new window that lets you essentially interact with R through, an interface. And this will actually make your life a lot easier, right? So as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through all these instructions here in detail. So this is what it looks like if you want to code it. But here is some some of the stuff that you know, the software can do. So it can actually show you the papers published over time, right? So it can give you information for the distribution of articles over time. We can also create a cited reference search, so that might be interesting for you if you don't want to do this manually, if you want to check what literature was cited by the papers that you have already identified. So that's possible to do. You can create bibliographic network. So this here is a collaboration network that essentially shows what country or researchers in what country are collaborating with what other countries. It's probably no big surprise here. You know, you see big countries or scientific countries such as the US and UK sticking out from this type of analysis, right? So that's definitely something that you can do. We've also got co-citation networks. That's somewhat similar to what I already showed you, except for this is not structured according to a timeline. This is sort of just structured across co-citation. So who is citing who? And you can sort of, you know, see here again, the program has decided, you know, to overlay that also with color coding for easier visualization here. Yeah, so this is essentially you know, opportunities here for how you can visualize work as well. Bibliometrics is also giving you the opportunity to develop a co-citation network based on historical information, so according to a timeline here. So this is not quite the same as HistCite, but somewhat similar in the sense that it also goes across, you know, historical citation. Here it's structured according to a timeline that's at the bottom here. Yeah, you can see as well, it's trying to show you how the field developed over time. So obviously a slightly different visualization compared to HistCite. I put a note here to talk about some of the differences, right? The historiograph in Bibliometrics is not 100% the same as the one that I showed you in HistCite, because it doesn't select papers on the highest citation counts. It actually works on co-citations. So essentially how articles are cited together by other articles, right? So again, my own interpretation is here, Bibliometrics, I'm not quite enjoying this type of citation network because it is more difficult to interpret. So consequently, I tend to use HistCite. But, you know, again, it does give you another tool in your toolbox as well, right? And then HistCite, you know, again, here's just some introduction. So HistCite looks like this, right? It's essentially a super basic program. It shows you, you know, your citation and then the different counts. Local citation count is, you know, how often other papers within your sample are citing that paper. Global citation count, the number of citations to that paper as, you know, reported in the Web of Science at that time. So you can see it's a really, really basic kind of program, a really basic kind of interface. And then what it lets you do is it does, you know, let you look at how many citations you get, the journals and so on. So it's like really kind of basic, but it does produce these beautiful citation maps, right? So that's essentially what it has got. You can see here, this comes with a very basic output, this citation graph. What I've then done to augment this, of course, is, you know, to introduce some color coding, to introduce some nicer labeling, but that's sort of like the post-production processing here. But yeah, this HistCite program essentially allows you to develop these maps. So it's very interesting in that regard. If you are interested in this further, Bibliometrics has actually got a very, very extensive website that has got a lot of really good information on there as well, right? So if you just go to the website for this RPEP package, Bibliometrics, I'll just see if I can quickly find it for you. Bibliometrics. So this here is just giving you all the information. Just let me quickly copy and paste that in the chat. So you will actually find, you know, that there is a lot of additional information available if you wanted to work with that particular R package. So you can definitely follow all these instructions there and get really, really great results for your literature review as well. So that's a really great resource as well. All right, we are coming to the end of the session. So obviously we haven't done any exercise around retrieving articles today. As I said, I suggest you get together in your groups. You can obviously organize that outside of this lecture here as well. And, have a chat to each other regarding, your field of research, how you might want to do a systematic review around this, and the kind of search parameters that you could use. And, then have a think about this, whether or not that might give you a systematic review. You can also have a look at some of the examples that I gave you as well. So you've got a starting point. And, of course, getting that input and feedback from others. Often when you talk to others about your research, they might say, oh, but why are you not searching for this term? Like, why have you searched for this particular issue, right? So why are you not considering other articles? I think it's actually a really, really valuable process as well for you to go through. All right. Do we have any more questions at this point? Or have I completely overwhelmed you with information on systematic reviews?
Thank you, Martina. I think one question is, do you have any, example or exercise for this one that is manageable, doable for the participant?
Yeah, look, as the exercise, right? I would suggest, definitely have a think about, everyone, what their own research area is, a research question that they are currently working on. You can pick anything that you work on at the moment, and, then get together in the groups and have a think about what kind of search terms you might want to use to get the systematic review going. What information do you want to include, right? Gray literature, no gray literature. What are the design parameters that you want to put into place? And yeah, of course, we can have a chat about this tomorrow, in the session as well, if there are questions about this. And, we can just, discuss that as well, some examples tomorrow, for what might actually constitute then a good approach to the review. Yeah.
Okay, right, got it. Thank you, Martina.
Thank you. All right. I think we've reached the end of the session for today. So it was great to have you all online. Of course, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, right? So tomorrow we are proceeding with the next step. So there's more to come on, surveys and experiments. And, of course, we'll just also, check in again on the progress from today to see if there's any remaining questions as well. And of course, feel free to email us as well with anything that's unclear.
Thank you, Martina.
Thank
What a
you.
class today.
I know there's so much to go through. Honestly, I tried to pack this all into the short time that we've got available, but hopefully it's giving you interesting pointers to start with, right? As I said, you can't just you can't just always get this done in like, a very quick period of time, right? It really comes down to sitting down with this information and working your way through these steps to see what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And as part of being a researcher, right, I think what makes it so exciting is that we actually get the luxury of, really kind of working our way through these steps. And you might just come back to me and say, look, Martina, I tried this thing with this site that totally doesn't work for me. Okay, well, whatever, you just pick what tool you like, right? And then you work with that. So yeah, cool. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Martina.
Thank you.
Bye,
Good to see you.
tomorrow.
Thanks.
Bye.
It's a
Thank
very
you.
big topic. You probably need 2 days instead of 2 hours. Yes?
We'll let you sleep on this overnight and then we'll see where everyone is tomorrow.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank